Do you like melee weapons in video games? If you're like me, then you might even prefer close combat to ranged combat, and you can't get enough of different swords. But what size of swords do you like? The bigger the better? Well, my opinion may be different from the popular one, but I hate gigantic swords. And it seems that there are more and more of them in video games. Why is that and what does it mean? I will try to figure it out.
Hi, I am Not-a-witchr, and this is not a sword. I mean, obviously, just look at it.
First, I'd like to state that my tastes may be different from yours, and that's okay. Second, I suspect that in questions that concern weapons in games, I might have a bit of an OCD. For example, in the old Infinity Engine RPGs, like Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale series, I was bugged by the character models that wielded shields and one-handed weapons. The developers used symmetrical reflections of the sprite models instead of making separate models, probably to reduce the size of the game assets, and they probably thought, who would notice anyway, right? But I noticed. Why is my character holding his shield in the left hand when he faces west, and when he faces east, he switches his shield hand? Is it to confuse his enemies? Or is it a religious thing? Even if the character is ambidextrous, why change hands? You see what are we dealing with here. Now to the actual topic. The size of swords is quite a divisive matter, with lots of fans of the big ones on YouTube and TikTok trying to prove to everybody that their creations could be used as weapons in real life, and with lots of opponents of that view, especially among the people who practice competitive swordsmanship or use history to base their opinion on. But that's the real-life swords, or replicas of swords. And what about the video games? Early games had swords made of pixels, and nobody expected them to be realistic. They were just symbols of weapons, not even the actual representation of weapons. Just like Super Mario is not an actual representation of an Italian plumber. Later we had 3D games that featured 3D weapons made of polygons. Big polygons. Still, no complaints there. But even when the games started to adopt more realistic-ish visuals, they were rarely based on the actual historically accurate weapons. There was just no need for that. And all this gives us decades of games that influenced our perception of the concept of melee weapons. Everybody knows what a sword looks like. But games, of course, weren't the first or the only type of media that showed us swords. Anime had a strong impact on the archetype of a sword, and not just katanas, but all kinds of them. Also movies, but they did not feature swords as often as games or anime. So it's probably safe to say that perception of a sword for a modern gaming audience is largely based not on actual physical artifacts that we can see in museums, but on a strange mix of fictional fantasies of different artists. And that's kinda okay, I guess, because humanity does not plan to bring back swords for use in actual warfare, no matter how hard the future fantasy fans would like that to happen. For games that lean towards more realistic portrayal of melee weapons, the expectations are quite strict. There are whole organizations that have science-based opinions on what those weapons should look like. But for a lot of fantasy games, the developers tend to reimagine the very idea of weapons. Like, what is this exactly? Or is this? I often have to remind myself that weapon models in games are not actual weapons, and they should not be treated as such. And right after that, the part of me that values immersion in games says, okay, they don't have to be realistic, but they at least should be believable. Like, if the game world has physics similar to our world, then a concept of gravity should be taken into account, right? And how am I supposed to believe that wearing this kind of weapon on the back of my character does not make them fall back when they just stand? By the way, why on the back? Even before The Witcher, Almost all of the characters in games carried their weapons on the back. Very often they do that without any sheath. How those weapons are holding there? Especially two-handed weapons. Why not a one cowboy had his two holsters on the back? What, pistols on the belt are cool and swords are not? Okay, try to calm down. Just breathe. There are games in which you carry two-handed weapons on your shoulder, almost like in the real. What the f*** is that? Let's step aside for a moment and touch the subject of the melee combat itself. I imagine that it is really hard to make a combat mechanics that is more or less realistic and at the same time is easy enough to get into for most of the players. Kingdom Come Deliverance developer Warhorse Studio tried to go in the direction of realism, and they deserve to be praised for their cool work. But many players have found their melee combat clunky and unnecessarily hard. On the other hand, I often hear complaints that modern games seem to be unable to escape the common formula of light attack, heavy attack, block and dodge. And I agree that from the perspective of realism, it doesn't make any sense, like why the strong attack is slower. In real life, the more strength you put into the swing, the faster your weapon should be moving as a result. And don't get me started on the dodge rolls that make the player invulnerable. But from a game designer perspective, as I imagine, it is important to give a player several simple concepts that they should be able to easily learn to feel competent enough in combat. Nobody wants to spend months or years in a game before they are ready to face their first enemy. And one of these simple concepts often happens to be a trade-off between the speed and the strength. Like, if you want to move fast and strike often, you will deal less damage with each strike than if you move more slowly and carefully time your attacks. This basically boils down to a class difference, like the class of your character, not social class, between a lightly armed thief or a rogue and a heavy armed warrior or a knight. Although there is much to be said about the social class difference between those two. Another example, the use of shields in games. If you want to be more protected and less skillable, then you will make less damage than if you take a gigantic... Okay, just breathe. By the way, have you noticed that games, especially RPGs, have this idea that if you have two functioning hands, and most characters do, then you should be using both of them all the time. It means that if you're not using shields or two-handed weapons, then you are probably using a weapon in each hand. And if you don't, what is wrong with you? What kind of warrior are you? Who fights with one hand just... And again with the realism. So you can probably see where I'm going with this. It's okay if not. The visual design of weapons in games almost always works on the reinforcement of the role of the weapon for the player. Have you noticed, for example, that when you progress in a game, the newer armor of higher quality than your character acquires as an upgrade usually have only two ways to be visually better than the previous, weaker armor? It can either be more intricately detailed, like engraved with gold, or have bigger spikes on the pauldrons, or bigger pauldrons. In a similar way, the better weapon can't look the same as your basic one, and if it's a third-person view game, then your weapon often is not that visible to admire the intricate details of the engraving on the blade. A weapon that does additional fire damage should burn like a torch, right? And the bigger the sword is, the more damage it probably does. Or at least it is expected by the players who are already used to this concept. Also, what's interesting, game designers often seem to think that their audience, meaning the players, simply just wouldn't understand if they made weapon size in games more realistic. Even in games that have a historical setting, like Assassin's Creed series. I mean, just look at this sword. which by its form looks just like a Roman gladius. Except the Roman gladius had overall length between 42 and 69 centimeters, or from 17 inches to 2.2 feet. So, if Bayek of Siwa is 6 feet tall, then this sword is around 2/3 of his height, and it's 4 feet, so twice the real length of the gladius. Did the game designers saw the original models and said, nah, too small? By the way, some of Bayek's weapons have really convenient feature. See if you can spot it. Similar thing in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. They have this weird mechanic. When Eivor puts their weapon away after a fight, the weapon becomes visually smaller to better fit with the character model. And the model of that axe on the belt is much more realistic in size than when you put it out again. And does it have an erection in battle? Would I like it better if the weapon size in Assassin's Creed games were more realistic? Yes, I would. A Viking's axe does not become more deadly if it grows bigger. In this case, size really does not matter if you know how to use it. Where am I going with all those jokes? Now, if you tell me that the character of some video game is just really strong so they can easily wield that gigantic piece of metal, then I would probably tell you that it does not work like that. First, just look at the actual two-handed swords that real historical warriors used to kill people. A two-handed sword should not weigh more than 3 kilograms or 7 pounds. Otherwise, no warrior would be able to swing that around for more than 20 seconds. And if a character is really that super strong, so they could easily wield a weapon that weighs, let's say, 20 times more than a real two-handed sword, then this character is able to kill everything with their bare hands. Why even use a weapon? Just throw some stones in the enemies and you will simply obliterate them. Also, a sword is not even the best weapon for a super strong person. Hammer, maybe. Axe makes some sense. But a sword became the most common medieval weapon because it was effective, it could be easily carried on the belt, it showed the status of its wielder, but most importantly, because it was good for both offense and defense at the same time. And gigantic swords, could they parry other gigantic swords? Yes, definitely. But it would mean that there are lots of them around, and when everybody have a gigantic sword, then you don't look so cool and unique after all. But what if your enemies are much bigger than you, like in Monster Hunter games? Then the video game logic tells us that in order to kill a gigantic beast, yep, you guessed it, you need a gigantic weapon. And the more ridiculous it looks, the more power it must have, right? Because it is exactly how our prehistoric ancestors hunted mammoths and woolly rhinos, with big stone swords. Okay, I think I made my point clear enough. That said, video games are not like real life, no matter how hard I would want them to look and feel like real life. And balancing visual design with gameplay mechanics and player expectations and tastes, it's a damn hard thing for a game designer. But it would be nice if someday, at least some games, would treat a sword like a sword, a deadly weapon, no matter the size of it.
So, in the spirit of that, I have to admit that if a weapon fits the whole setting and the aesthetic of the game, then it's just rightfully there, and if someone doesn't like it, they don't have to use it. It's as simple as that. And this is not less of a sword than this. So thank you for watching, and as always, take care and farewell.